Homecoming. Chapter 1. A New Beginning. David is a kind man. He has just moved to Lakewood Manor. He is happy but also a little nervous. He married his second wife, Rachel, and they live in a big house now. Lakewood Manor is beautiful. It has many trees and a big lake. The house is old but very nice. David likes the peace and quiet. He likes to walk in the garden. Rachel has a sister named Laura. Laura lives nearby. Laura is very different from Rachel. She likes to be in control. One day, Laura comes to visit. David feels nervous. Laura says, "Hello, David. How are you?" David replies, "Hello, Laura. I am fine, thank you." Laura looks around the house. She is not very friendly. David feels uncomfortable. David thinks, why is Laura so serious? Rachel comes in with coffee. Rachel says, "Here is some coffee, Laura. How do you like our home?" Laura answers, "It is nice, Rachel, but it needs some work." David feels a bit sad. He wants Laura to like their home. David says, "We are planning to fix some things. It will look better soon." Laura says, "I hope so, David." Laura drinks her coffee and looks at David. David feels nervous again. Rachel is very different from Laura. Rachel is kind and soft-spoken. She loves David very much. She sees that David is nervous. Rachel says, "David, why don't you show Laura the garden?" David smiles. He likes the garden. David says, "Yes, of course. Laura, would you like to see the garden?" Laura says, "Sure, David." They walk to the garden. The garden is big and full of flowers. David feels happy here. David thinks, "I hope Laura likes the garden. It is my favorite place." David says, "This is my favorite place, Laura. It is very peaceful." Laura says, "It is nice, David. You did a good job." David feels a little better. David and Laura walk back to the house. Rachel is waiting for them. Rachel says, "How was the garden?" Laura says, "It was nice, Rachel. David did a good job." David feels happy. Maybe Laura will like him after all. He hopes they can all be friends. David thinks, "I want to make Rachel and Laura happy. I hope we can be a good family." The sun sets over Lakewood Manor. Chapter 2. A Disappearance. One morning, Rachel is packing her bags. David asks, "Rachel, where are you going?" Rachel smiles and says, "I am going to Boston. I need to see some friends." David feels a little sad but says, "Okay, Rachel, I will miss you." Rachel leaves, and David feels lonely. Laura comes to visit again. She looks at David and says, "Where is Rachel?" David replies, "She went to Boston to see some friends." Laura looks surprised. She says, "Rachel does not have friends in Boston. Are you sure?" David feels worried. He says, "Yes, she told me she has friends there." Laura frowns and says, "I don't believe you, David. Something is not right." David feels nervous. He thinks, why does Laura always suspect me? Laura asks, "Did Rachel take all her things?" David replies, "No, she only took a small bag." Laura looks around the house and says, "I want to see Rachel's room." David feels scared but says, "Okay, follow me." They go to Rachel's room. Laura opens the closet. She says, "Most of her clothes are still here. Why didn't she take more clothes?" David says, "Maybe she does not need many clothes." Laura looks at David with suspicion. She says, "David, I don't trust you. Where is Rachel really?" David feels angry and sad. He says, "Laura, I am telling the truth. Rachel went to Boston." Laura shakes her head. She says, "I will find out the truth, David." After Laura leaves, David sits alone in the living room. He thinks about Rachel. He misses her very much. He hopes she will come back. David goes to bed but cannot sleep. He thinks about what Laura said. He feels worried and lonely. He whispers, "I hope Rachel is okay." The house feels very quiet without Rachel. David feels very sad and alone. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Past. David is walking in the small town near Lakewood Manor. He sees a woman who looks like Rachel. She is wearing a red coat. David feels surprised. He thinks, "Is that Rachel?" He starts to follow her. The woman turns a corner and David runs to catch up. But when he turns the corner, she is gone. David feels confused. He whispers to himself, "Where did she go?" Later, David is at home. Laura comes to visit again. She looks serious. Laura says, "David, I heard something about your first wife, Anna." David feels a bit nervous. He asks, "What did you hear?" Laura says, "They say Anna died in an accident. She fell into the lake and drowned." David feels sad. He says, "Yes, it was a very sad day. Anna could not swim." Laura looks at him closely. She asks, "Were you there, David?" David nods. He says, "Yes, I was there, but I could not save her." Laura frowns and says, "No one else saw the accident?" David shakes his head. He says, "No, no one else was there." Laura looks suspicious. She says, "This sounds strange, David. I don't believe you." David feels upset. He says, "Laura, I am telling the truth. It was an accident." Laura does not look convinced. She says, "I will find out the truth, David." David feels worried. As David walks back to the house, he sees a shadow in the garden. It looks like a woman. David feels scared. He thinks, "Is that Rachel?" He calls out, "Rachel, is that you?" The shadow does not move. David walks closer, but the shadow is gone. He feels very confused and scared. He thinks, "What is happening? Am I seeing things?" David goes back inside the house. He feels very tired and worried. He whispers to himself, "I hope Rachel is okay. I miss her so much." He goes to bed, but he cannot sleep. David thinks about Laura's questions and feels very uneasy. He hopes everything will be okay soon. Chapter 4. The First Clue. One morning, David hears the phone ring. He picks it up and says, "Hello?" A voice on the phone says, "David, it's Rachel. I miss you." David feels shocked. He asks, "Rachel, is that really you?" The voice says, "Yes, it's me. I will come home soon." David feels confused and happy. He says, "Rachel, where are you?" But the call ends. David feels worried. He thinks, "Was that really Rachel?" Later, Laura visits David. She looks at him closely and asks, "Who called you, David?" David feels nervous. He says, "It was Rachel. She said she will come home soon." Laura frowns and says, "David, I don't believe you. Rachel would not call like that." David feels upset. He says, "Why do you always doubt me, Laura?" Laura looks serious. She says, "Because something is not right, David. I will find out the truth." David receives a letter the next day. The letter is from Rachel. It says, "Dear David, I miss you. I will come home soon. Love, Rachel." David feels happy but also confused. He thinks, "Is this really from Rachel?" Laura visits again. She sees the letter and asks, "What is that, David?" David says, "It is a letter from Rachel." Laura looks at the letter and says, "This does not look like Rachel's writing." David feels worried. He says, "Laura, it is from Rachel. She will come home soon." Laura shakes her head and says, "David, I think someone is playing a trick on you." David feels angry. He says, "Laura, why can't you believe me? Rachel will come back." That night, David hears the phone ring again. He picks it up and says, "Hello?" The voice on the phone says, "David, it's Rachel. I'm coming home soon." David feels scared. He asks, "Rachel, where are you?" The voice says, "I am in a safe place. Don't worry." David feels confused and worried. He thinks, "Is this really Rachel? Or is someone playing a trick on me?" David goes to bed but cannot sleep. He thinks about Rachel and the strange phone calls. He whispers to himself, "Rachel, please come home soon. I miss you so much." The next morning, Laura visits again. She looks at David and says, "David, you look very tired. Are you okay?" David feels sad and says, "I'm worried about Rachel. I hope she is okay." Laura looks at him with concern and says, "David, we need to find out what is really happening." David nods and thinks, "I hope we find Rachel soon." Chapter 5. A Nighttime Encounter. One night, David is in bed. He cannot sleep. Suddenly the phone rings. David picks it up and says, "Hello?" The voice says, "David, it's Rachel. I am not far away." David feels shocked. He asks, "Rachel, where are you?" The voice says, "I am close. Do not worry." David feels very confused. He thinks, "Is this really Rachel?" He decides to go outside. He puts on his coat and walks to the garden. In the garden, David hears a noise. He sees a shadow near the trees. David feels scared. He calls out, "Rachel, is that you?" The shadow does not answer. David walks closer, but the shadow moves away. David feels very worried. He thinks, "What is happening? Am I seeing things?" He decides to go back to the house. He is very tired and scared. The next morning, Laura comes to visit. She looks at David and says, "David, you look very tired. Did something happen?" David feels nervous. He says, "I heard Rachel on the phone again. I saw a shadow in the garden." Laura gets worried. David feels very tired and scared. He thinks, "I hope we find out the truth soon. I miss Rachel so much." Chapter 6. The Unveiling. One evening, David is sitting in the living room. He hears the phone ring again. David picks it up and says, "Hello?" The voice says, "David, it's Rachel. Come to the garden now." David feels very nervous. He asks, "Rachel? Is that really you?" The voice says, "Yes, come to the garden." David grabs his flashlight and goes to the garden. He feels scared, but also curious. In the garden, he sees the shadow again. David calls out, "Rachel, is that you?" The shadow steps forward. It is Laura. David feels shocked. He asks, "Laura, what are you doing here?" Laura looks serious. She says, "David, I have been watching you. I wanted to know the truth." David feels angry. He says, "Why are you doing this, Laura? Why do you doubt me?" Laura replies, "David, I think you know more about Rachel than you say. I wanted to see your reaction." David feels very upset. He says, "Laura, I love Rachel. I am telling the truth." Laura looks at him closely. She says, "David, I hired private detectives. They have been watching you." Just then, two men step out of the shadows. They are the detectives. David feels scared and confused. He says, "I thought Rachel was calling me. I thought she was near." The detective shakes his head. He says, "David, it was all a trick. Laura asked us to help her." David feels very upset. He looks at Laura and says, "Why did you do this? I miss Rachel. I thought she was coming back." Laura looks sad. She says, "I wanted to know the truth, David. I am sorry." The detectives step forward. One of them says, "We found out where Rachel is. She is safe." David feels shocked. He asks, "Where is she?" The detective replies, "Rachel is at a health farm." David feels relieved but also angry. He says, "Why didn't she tell me? Why did you play this trick on me, Laura?" Laura looks at him with sad eyes. She says, "I thought you were hiding something. I am sorry, David." David feels very tired and upset. He says, "I need to rest. I hope Rachel comes home soon." Laura nods and says, "She will be back soon, David. Please forgive me." David goes back to the house. He feels very tired and sad. He whispers to himself, "Rachel, please come home soon. I miss you so much." He goes to bed and hopes for better days ahead. Chapter 7. Rachel's Return. One morning, the phone rings. David picks it up and says, "Hello?" The voice says, "David, it's Rachel. I am coming home today." David feels very happy. He says, "Rachel, that is great news. I missed you so much." Later that day, David waits by the window. He sees a car arrive. Rachel gets out of the car. She looks different. She looks happy and healthy. David runs outside and says, "Rachel, you are home." Rachel smiles and says, "Yes, David, I am home. I missed you." David hugs her and says, "I missed you too, Rachel. You look wonderful." Rachel laughs and says, "Thank you, David. I feel much better now. The health farm was good for me." David feels very happy. He says, "Come inside. I have a surprise for you." They go inside the house. David shows Rachel new clothes. He says, "I got these for you, Rachel. Do you like them?" Rachel looks at the clothes and says, "Yes, David. They are beautiful. Thank you." David smiles and says, "Laura helped me get them. She is sorry for what she did." Rachel looks surprised. She asks, "What did Laura do?" David explains, "She played tricks on me. She thought I was hiding something, but now she knows the truth." Rachel nods and says, "I see. I am glad she understands now." David feels relieved. He says, "Yes, everything is okay now." That evening, they sat together in the living room. Rachel says, "David, I am happy to be home. Thank you for everything." David smiles and says, "I am happy you are home too, Rachel. I love you." Rachel smiles and says, "I love you too, David." They hold hands and feel very happy. David thinks, "Everything is good now. We are together again." The next morning, David and Rachel go for a walk in the garden. Rachel looks around and says, "The garden is beautiful, David. You did a great job." David feels proud. He says, "Thank you, Rachel. I worked hard on it." Rachel looks at him and says, "I can see that. I am very happy to be home." David smiles and says, "I am happy too, Rachel. We will be happy together." David and Rachel sit by the lake. They feel peaceful and content. David thinks, "This is how it should be. We are together and happy." Rachel looks at David and says, "Yes, David, everything is perfect now." They watch the sunset together. They both feel very happy and at peace. The end. The story is aligned with the A1 level of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, CEFR, which is the beginner level. Here are 5 phrases from the story along with their meanings and examples. 1. Nervous, meaning feeling worried or anxious about something. Example from the story. David feels very nervous. He asks, "Rachel, is that really you?" Example in real life. I felt nervous before my big presentation at work. 2. Curious, meaning eager to know or learn something. Example from the story. David grabs his flashlight and goes to the garden. He feels scared but also curious. Example in real life. The children were curious about the new student in their class. 3. Relieved, meaning feeling happy because something unpleasant has stopped or has not happened. Example from the story. David feels relieved. He says, "Thank you, Laura. That will help a lot." Example in real life. I felt relieved when I found my lost keys. 4. Detective, meaning a person, usually a police officer, whose job is to investigate and solve crimes. Example from the story. Just then, 2 men step out of the shadows. They are the detectives. Example in real life. The detective worked hard to solve the mystery of the missing jewelry. 5. Surprise, meaning an unexpected event or thing that makes someone feel astonished. Example from the story. David shows Rachel new clothes. He says, "I got these for you, Rachel. Do you like them?" Example in real life. My friends planned a surprise birthday party for me, and I was so happy. Here are 3 things the reader can learn from the story. 1. Trust and communication are crucial in relationships. 2. Patience and perseverance. Pay off. 3. Forgiveness and understanding can mend relationships. This story and voiceover have been provided by English Made Easy. Learn through stories. Copying or re-uploading is strictly prohibited.